This is Salmond and Sunday on LBC, leading Britain's conversation, and this hour we're talking Brexit. Yes, we're talking Brexit again, but we're talking Brexit with a twist, because this weekend it emerged that the Prime Minister's entire Social Mobility Commission, led by former Labour Minister Alan Milburn, has resigned. And they've resigned because they believe the Prime Minister is betraying the families that voted for Brexit because she's spending all her time in Brexit and none of her time in social mobility. So that's the charge for this hour. Is the Prime Minister betraying those who voted for Brexit because that is consuming all of her attention and key issues like social mobility are on the back burner? Now, we have a very special guest to discuss this with us for the first part of this hour, and that's Joanna Cherry QC and MP, the member of the Brexit Committee, which reported on Friday about the goings-on thus far in the Brexit process, and the SNP Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South West. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So your report, the Brexit Committee report on Friday, was a wee bit lost in the hullabaloo that was happening with the Donald Trump tweets and the possible investigation and everything else that happened. What were the absolute key findings of this cross-party committee?
Well, I think one of the key findings, which is very relevant to the debate that's been going on this weekend, was about the question of the border between the north and the south of Ireland. Because our committee, which reported by majority, but a majority of members in the committee all backed this report, have basically said that it's very difficult to see a solution to the border problem unless the United Kingdom stays in the single market and stays in the customs union. And so I think what this shows is it's not just the Irish government or the EU 27 being difficult. A cross-party committee of MPs from all parties in the House of Commons have said that really it's impossible to find a solution to the border problem, or very difficult to see how you could, unless the United Kingdom stays in the single market and the customs union. So that was one of the key findings.
So how many people in the House of Commons are on this super Brexit
There's 21
committee?
of us.
And from the amount of work that you've had to do in terms of covering all of the multifarious issues around Brexit, do you have sympathy for Alan Milburn and his resigned commission who say, look, we can't get on with the job of social mobility because the Prime Minister's preoccupied by Brexit?
Well, yes, I do. And I noticed that Alan Milburn said that the approach of the government to social mobility was characterised by indecision, dysfunctionality and a lack of leadership. And I think that's pretty much what characterises the UK government's approach to Brexit at the moment. Indecision, dysfunctionality and a lack of leadership. People pulling in different directions, people like Boris insulting the Irish when he goes there, Theresa May so busy trying to sort out her cabinet's infighting that she's not actually able to take any decisions about the Brexit process, which is why we find ourselves right up against the deadline without having solved the problem of the border in Ireland.
But surely Boris Johnson, I mean, he insults people across the planet. I mean, his insults are not confined either to the Irish or even to other Europeans. He insults people on a fairly even-handed basis and across the entire world, does he not?
Indeed, and I think even the Foreign and Commonwealth Office recognise that, because his officials specifically told the Irish government to ignore anything that Boris said when he was over there recently. And I understand that he's pretty much being bypassed, and there's quite frantic work going on behind the scenes to see if the British government can come up with a solution to the border issue this weekend.
Joanna, people listening to this, many people who voted for Brexit will be hearing you and saying, look, yeah, Joanna Cherry, one of the leading pro-Europeans in the House of Commons, very learned leading pro-European, of course, but nonetheless, everything that she says is going to be coloured by the view you think this whole Brexit thing's a disaster in the first place. So why should one of our listeners who perhaps voted for Brexit believe you when you say, look, this is a real problem?
Okay. Well, I think in politics, as in any argument, you can't really be effective unless you try and understand the other side's point of view. And one of the things I've noticed since I got elected to Parliament 2 or 3 years ago, travelling around provincial England to go to things like Any Questions and Question Time, is that there are very significant parts of England that are extremely run down with very poor social fabric, poor housing, poor NHS and poor education. And I think what Alan Milburn's Commission's work has shown is that the vote to leave very much correlates with those areas of England that have been, in a sense, left behind. And I think Scotland is different because we've had a devolved government for 20 years, and under successive Labour Lib Dem in your own government, we've been able to take steps to improve housing in Scotland, improve health and education. And I think those steps haven't been taken in these swathes of provincial England which feel a bit left behind. While London and the South East booms, they don't. So I think the Brexit vote in these areas was very much a protest against the fact that these people feel that they have been overlooked and left behind by the metropolitan elite, London and the southeast of England. But what's really interesting is that Alan Milburn and his colleagues have resigned because they say that although Theresa May uttered all these fine words about wanting to help people who were just about managing. And
when she entered Downing Street.
Indeed, she made a speech perhaps a little bit reminiscent of Margaret Thatcher's speech when she entered Downing Street, promising many great things. But what's significant about these mass resignations over the weekend is that these people have resigned because they say she's done next to nothing to try and close the social gap and the attainment gap, in contrast, of course, to the Scottish Government, who are taking very significant steps in Scotland at the moment to try and address poverty and close the attainment gap.
If I remember correctly, Margaret Thatcher quoted St Francis of Assisi when she entered Downing Street, although there was a fairly limited putting into practice of St Francis's teachings in the next 10 years, as I recall it. But nonetheless, Joanna, I mean, coming into Parliament, into these discussions as a trained advocate, one of Scotland's leading advocates, apart from taking a massive drop in your salary, are you kind of struck with the almost irrationality with which people address these issues? I mean, in your committee, between the Brexiteers on the one hand and people like yourself who are passionately pro-European, do you actually manage to get beyond the politics and identify some of the issues which are a real difficulty for people?
Well, I think we have with this report, Alec, because a majority of the committee, including several Tories, have got behind this report, and we've really gone to the heart of the issues, and we've looked at issues such as the Irish border, but we also looked at the citizenship issue, and we said really that if the EU and the UK can reach a deal in protecting citizens' rights, that deal ought to be ring-fenced. But if that doesn't happen, then the United Kingdom should make a unilateral declaration to protect the rights of EU citizens in the UK. And in doing that, we weren't ignoring the rights of UK citizens living in the EU 27, because we heard evidence from them, the same committee in the last Parliament, and they told us, organisations representing the UK citizens living in the EU 27, that they would like to see the British government make a unilateral declaration of rights of EU citizens living here, because they felt that if that was done in the UK, then the EU 27 would reciprocate. So the committee has cross-party, Tory MPs, Labour MPs, SNP MPs, one Plaid Cymru MP and one Lib Dem have all supported the idea that if a deal can't be reached, then there should be a unilateral decree, a unilateral guarantee by the United Kingdom government. And of course the House of Commons voted for that last week when the SNP held a debate on this issue, and the Tories didn't turn up to vote, so the motion went through that there should be a unilateral declaration. So that was one issue we addressed in
addition
to the Irish border.
That's a non-binding vote in the House of Commons. But you've identified, obviously, the kind of free issues which have been come before we can go on to discussing the trade. That's been the position of European citizens, the money being paid to the European Union, which Boris Johnson once upon a time said they could go and whistle for, but we now know is 50 billion and rising. And thirdly, the position in Ireland in terms of the not having a border in Ireland between north and south. Of these three issues, Joanna Cherry, with your experience, which one do you think is proving the most intractable?
It's the Irish question is proving the most intractable, which of course has been something that's been the case for the UK for more than a century. But the difficulty with the Irish question is, on the money, the British government can throw the towel in, and that's what they've done. Having huffed and puffed, they've thrown the towel in and they're going to pay the money now. On EU citizens, they could also throw the towel in by recognising that the Court of Justice has to have some ongoing role in protecting EU citizens' rights. But on the border, it's not just a question of throwing the towel in, it's a responsibility to come up with an actual solution to the problem of how you maintain an open border if the south of Ireland remains in the EU, as they wish to do, and the north of Ireland leaves the single market and the customs union. So the difficulty for the British government is they can't just throw in the towel, they actually have to come up with a concrete solution to the border issue. And I think that's why it's proving the biggest stumbling block, because to quote Alan Milburn's word, Alan Milburn's words, it's an indecisive, dysfunctional government with a lack of leadership. This is a really difficult problem. Our committee, the committee I sit on, said there probably wasn't a solution to it. It was hard to see a solution, and I think that's why the British government are becoming unstuck on this.
Joanna, can I ask you something? Would you be prepared to stay on for the next 20 minutes or so? I want you to take some calls from people who favoured Brexit, who want to say, and perhaps who think, look, you know, why isn't this happening? Is it just a sabotage by the Remainers? I mean, is Theresa May being unfairly pilloried for not being able to get on with things? Is it people like Joanna Cherry and your colleagues on that committee who are raising all these problems? So I want people, listeners who favour Brexit, in particular, and other people phone in as well, please, but who can put questions direct to Joanna, see if you can put her to the test and work out why she seems to be engaged in this committee but raising all of these difficulties with what could have been or should have been, or perhaps the people thought would have been a fairly simple process. Joanna, you've said what the various problems are. You've said that the Irish question is intractable. Has there ever before been a situation where Ireland, because of the backing of the other EU 27, has effectively ended up over the next few weeks in a more powerful position than the British government?
I hesitate to be categorical, but I think it's unprecedented for Ireland to be in a position to effectively call the shots. I mean, we saw Donald Tusk in Dublin on Friday basically saying it was up to the Irish government to be satisfied, and the remaining EU 26 would wait to hear if Ireland was satisfied with the solution to the border. But I think it's really important for your listeners to understand, Alec, that this isn't the Irish government being capricious. The Irish government's got a legal duty to protect the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, as has the British government. And this is what this is really all about. People fear that if there's a hard border with border crossing posts and infrastructure on the border, it will be a magnet for those terrorists that remain on both sides of the Irish question, the extremes of both sides, to cause difficulty. And I think none of us want that. So Britain, having created the problem by voting to leave, it's our duty to solve it.
Thank you, Joanna Cherry. So please put your questions and thoughts to Joanna on the way that these Brexit negotiations are going, and whether Theresa May is so obsessed by the Brexit process that she's effectively betraying those who voted to leave the European Union. She has no time, according to Alan Milburn and his colleagues on the Commission on Equality, to deal with that issue because the government is consumed by Brexit. So this is Salmond and Sunday on LBC, leading Britain's conversation, and our subject again is Brexit, and in particular, is the Prime Minister, Theresa May, effectively betraying the people who voted for Brexit because she's so consumed in the Brexit process? She has, in the words of former Labour Minister Alan Milburn and his committee have all resigned this weekend, she has no time to deal with issues like social mobility. Now, I have with me Joanna Cherry, the member of the House of Commons Brexit Committee, and this is a real opportunity for people to put a question direct to a member of that key committee in the House of Commons at the present moment. So call 0345 6060 973, text 84850, or tweet at LBC. Rob from Edinburgh, good afternoon.
Mr. Salmond, good afternoon.
Yes, on you go, Rob. Have you got a question for me or for Joanna Cherry?
Well, it was a point about it earlier on. You're talking about social mobility, right? I work in the telecommunications industry, and I see the pressure on prices at the moment. All right, the falling pound, the pressure on living standards and wages. I see it constantly on the door when I work. I think this Brexit is a disaster. It's a disaster in many ways. It's a disaster for the Irish question that you and Joanna were raising earlier. It's a disaster for the people in this country. There's no question. Right? But what I cannot understand is why do people vote for these clowns in the Tory party for them to maintain power, to preside over such a disaster. I do not understand why the people do not demand a general election across the country to get these clowns out and to get people in. I just don't understand it. Right?
Rob, but can I put that direct to Joanna? Joanna, you thinking of having another general election? You think you're up for that, Joanna?
I think I'm still in recovery mode from the last one, Alec, but I do hear what Rob's saying. I suppose what I would say, Rob, is it's I suppose it's important for us to remember that the Tories didn't actually win the last general election. They're only in power as a result of bribing the DUP to support them, and it looks like they might be just about to fall out with the DUP over the Irish issue. But I think one of the big issues here is it's different for voters in Scotland. They have a political party that's quite clearly always been against Brexit. But for voters south of the border, they don't have a big political party that's against Brexit because the Labour Party has sat on the fence about the issue. They do, of course, have the Lib Dems, but we saw how unpopular the Lib Dems were in the last general election. So I think one of the problems for voters in England, those who never wanted to leave, and those who've perhaps changed their mind as they've seen what you describe, the falling pound and the pressure on living standards and wages, they don't have a party, a major political party in England.
Is the Labour Party not segueing towards anti-Brexit just now?
It's certainly halfway through performing what might be described as a U-turn. It went into the last general election on a manifesto saying it would deliver a Brexit for jobs, but it seems to be backtracking on that now, and I think it's possible, as it realises just how much of a disaster Brexit is, it may change its position. But the difficulty we have is there are a small number of highly vocal and influential Labour MPs, such as Kate Hoey, who are fervent Brexiteers, and for every Tory rebel that we might persuade to eventually actually act upon their rebellion and go through the lobbies rather than just talking about it, for every Tory rebel there is a Labour rebel to cross them out, or a Labour pro-Brexit MP.
Rob, you've got Joanna here. Here's a chance for you. Do you want to put a question direct to Joanna? She's on the Brexit committee. She knows what's going on. Have you got a question direct for her?
Yeah, Joanna, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm very well, thanks, Rob.
Good, thanks. The question I have is do we see Irish reunification as a result of this process?
Well, of course, the absolute core principle of the Good Friday Agreement was that Ireland can only be reunified by the consent of people both north and south of the border, and that has to be a consent-based process. Whether or not the movement towards that consent might be accelerated by Brexit, I think is a good question. It's important, of course, to remember that the majority of people who live in Northern Ireland voted to remain and now see themselves at the heart of the problem with this threat of a hard border because of something they didn't even vote for. Of course, that may change opinion on the unionist side in due course. It's important to appreciate that the DUP do not speak for all unionists. We have an independent unionist in the House of Commons, Lady Sylvia Herman, who would take a very different approach from the DUP and a much more nuanced approach to dealing with her southern neighbours.
That was Rob from Edinburgh. Jill from Northampton. Good afternoon, Jill.
Hiya. Regarding the border, I accept with the Good Friday Agreement that there shouldn't be a border, and also with regards, it has to have consideration in regards of the wishes of the people that live in Ayr and in Northern Ireland. So lots of people's concerns regarding the border is that I believe Ireland is still, or Ayr is still part or signed up to the Schengen Agreement. And therefore, people are worried, a lot of people are worried, not everyone, but a lot of people are worried that the illegal immigrants could still, via that route, get, easy passage into the UK. And I'm thinking, okay, you can't have a hard border in Ireland itself, but surely on the boundaries of Britain, or the island of Britain, so from the island of Ayr, of Ireland itself, so they're both islands, you've got to cross the water. We should have, as an island state, borders, some sort of borders, or border checks, literally along, all our beaches or all our periphery.
Jill, I think that's an excellent question. I think, strictly speaking, Ireland is not in Schengen, but But nonetheless, it's a really interesting question for Joanna Cherry. Can you address Jill's query is, why can't there be a border in order to restrict immigration?
Right. Hi, Jill. I think there's two issues here. There's the issue of movement of people, and then there's the issue of movement of goods. And nowadays, the movement of people and immigration is mainly controlled not so much by borders or hard borders, but at the point of contact where people interact with the employment market or the social security market. So, for example, you could be you can cross the border as an illegal immigrant, but you can't get a job because you don't have a national insurance number. You can't get social security. So that's really how we control immigration in the modern world. I think the issue that's concerning people about the border between the north and the south of Ireland is not so much immigration, but trade in goods. Because the proposal at the moment of the British government is that Brexit should mean that the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland leave the single market and the customs union. And that means that there has to be a hard border between the north and the south of Ireland, because there have to be customs checks on goods. So it's more about trade than people, and that's the evidence that we've heard on the committee that I sit on with other MPs has very much been about the practical difficulties in having trade across the border rather than moving people, if you get my drift.
Jill, does that help you, or do you want a direct question to Joanna on this aspect?
No, that is helpful, but I wasn't concerned about the transportation of goods to and from Ireland. What the ordinary person, I think, has spoken of, including me, is the risk of people jumping into the backs of the lorries and then coming over. Now, I take your point about what you said about social security, etc., but that hasn't stopped illegal immigration, because that's always been the case. It's never stopped them in the past. So it's all about the numbers, and it's not about the goods, the products that are coming in. It's about people coming in. That's always been the issue here in this country. This country has enough poor of its own. It doesn't need to allow more poor into the country, and that's what's been happening for the past 30 years, in my opinion.
Well, actually, the facts don't support what you're saying, Jill, with all due respect, because the facts show that EU migration from the EU into the United Kingdom has actually had a net benefit for the UK economy. But just to go back to the Irish question, even if Britain does leave the single market and the customs union, we're still going to have a common travel area between Ireland and the United Kingdom, which existed prior to the European Union, and it's as a result of it the fact that historically Ireland was in a union with the United Kingdom and then left, as we all know, in the 1920s, but a common travel area was kept. And so Irish citizens have always been able to get in and out of the United Kingdom with a greater degree of ease than citizens from other countries in the EU.
With Alex Salmond.
This is Salmond and Sunday on LBC, leading Britain's conversation, and we have a very special half hour in store for you, because I have with me Joanna Cherry QC, a member of the House of Commons Brexit Committee, the honourable member for Edinburgh South West in the House of Commons, but an actual member of the committee which is studying these matters and in a great position to answer questions. Now, my challenge is, in particular, to the Brexiteer listeners, this is a great opportunity to question, to ask people, to ask Joanna Cherry exactly what's going on in that committee. Why is Brexit proving such a problem? We had this weekend the mass resignation of all of the Social Mobility Commission of the Prime Minister, saying, look, this Brexit thing is absorbing so much time, there's no time to deal with social mobility, we're off. That was Alan Milburn and his colleagues, saying that Theresa May was effectively betraying the families who'd voted for Brexit. But you may have a different view, and this is the opportunity to question Joanna Cherry, to see if it's all these MPs making up problems and suggesting things are much more difficult than they are. Or maybe you're trying to find out what exactly is so intractable, for example, about the question of the Irish border. And Joanna Cherry is exactly the right position to tell you this. She's a very, very famous advocate in Scotland. That's like a barrister in England. And this is an opportunity to question her for nothing at all. You don't even have to pay for the legal advice and interpretation that Joanna Cherry gives you on this programme. So call 0345 6060 973, text 84850, or tweet at LBC. Norman from Rick's Mansworth, Good afternoon, Norman.
Good afternoon. Beware the free lawyer.
Beware the expensive lawyer, Norman, in my estimation, but on you go.
Right, I don't follow the logic of what has been said so far on the question of Ireland. As I see it, there are two alternatives. We have a deal with the EU, in which case the border will be what the EU thinks is the right answer, or we have no deal with the EU, in which case, why do we care if it's an open border? Why does everyone assume who's a Remainer that we will always lose out? It is an open border into Europe is a major opportunity for small British businesses to work through Ireland and vice versa. And let EU deal with it. If they don't want it, they'll deal with it. It's the only subject on which we should capitulate. Open borders in Ireland, we don't care.
There's Norman put you on the spot there, Joanna. He says open borders in Ireland. Why should we care about it?
Well, the simple fact of the matter is, at the moment, there is an open border because north and south of it, both countries are in the EU, so both countries are members of the single market, both countries are members of the customs union, so no tariffs are applied to goods crossing that border, so there's no need for any customs infrastructure. The difficulty is that if Britain chooses to leave the single market and the customs union, Ireland, as a member of the EU 27, will be duty-bound to have some kind of a border because there will have to be tariffs applied because we won't have free trade with the EU any longer.
But, Joanna, why is that necessarily the case? I mean, I know your committee has examined things practically on the spot. Let's take two countries out with the European Union. Liechtenstein, who are a member of the European Economic Area, they're part of the single market. Switzerland, which although they have an association with the EU, is not. And yet in that Liechtenstein-Switzerland border, you can walk across the River Rhine, across the bridges and walk back again. There's no sign of border posts. Aren't people just making a mountain out of a molehill here?
Well, that's because Switzerland has a series of bilateral deals with the European Union that govern these matters. Now, at the moment, Britain doesn't need any of those bilateral deals because we're in the single market and we're in the customs union, and that's to the benefit of us from a free trade point of view. But when we leave, it will take time for us to build up those bilateral deals. But the real issue about the border is the Good Friday Agreement. When the Good Friday Agreement was entered into almost 20 years ago, both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland came under certain legal duties because it's an international treaty, and those duties are to preserve the peace and to preserve north-south and east-west relations. And the fear is that the existence of a border will be a magnet, as I said earlier, for extreme terrorists on either side. Now, this isn't my opinion or just the opinion of the members of Parliament and the committee. It's the evidence that we've heard, because what the committee does is it sits there and it listens to evidence from a variety of different people. And it's not just people like me who are pro-Remain that choose the witnesses. There's people like Jacob Rees-Mogg on the committee and John Whittingdale and Christopher Chope who are ardent Brexiteers, and they're able to have input into who the witnesses are as well.
Steve from Bristol. Good afternoon, Steve. Do you want to put a question on this straight to Joanna?
Yes, please, Alex. Yeah, hello there. Hello, Joanna.
Hi, Steve.
Hello there. My question is, well, first of all, I think the reason why it's all taking so long is because I think there's lots of Remainers putting a spanner in the work, and of course, how Juncker and Monsieur Barnier are a pair of rotters. My question is...
Did you want to say rotters, Steve, or is that a euphemism?
I'll stick with rotters. Just as in old school, not very nice people.
Very good, Steve. On you go.
Okay. And so what if we left? What if we said, right, as Vida say in Berlin, we're off, Trade organisation for us. How would that, I mean, I'm sure it's kind of really complicated, but how would that affect the border and what have you in Ireland? Because it seems to me, you know, that everybody wants it, but the EU come along and, as ever, make everything very complicated.
Well, can I just tell you what our cross-party committee decided about that after hearing evidence from various trade experts? And I'm going to quote directly what we said. We said, it's difficult to imagine any possible deal consistent with WTO and other international treaties that would be more damaging to the UK's interests than leaving the EU with no deal whatsoever in place. So we took the view that the most damaging thing the United Kingdom could do to its economy and its interests would be to crash out without a deal. And that's a cross-party committee with Conservatives who agreed with that proposition as well. Now, what we're really saying there is that we've been part of the EU for 40 years, longer. We have all these intricate rules and regulations which are part of the EU, which British business currently conducts its business on the basis of. And if we drop out without a deal and suddenly leave all those regulations and have nothing to put in their place, then it's going to be really damaging to business. People are going to lose their jobs, and it's going to damage the British economy. So I understand why it looks like people who want to leave, it looks like people like me are deliberately throwing spanners in the works. But we are under a duty as members of Parliament to make sure that the government doesn't do something that will damage the British economy and make the people who voted to leave lose their jobs.
Steve, you don't believe this nice lady, Joanna Cherry, is deliberately putting a spanner in the works, do you, Steve? Or do you think she's got some sense in what she says?
Well, I understood what she said. I think I got what you said, Joanna, and I wasn't having a go at you with the old spanner.
No, that's okay. You feel free.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm not quite sure. It's all very complicated with all these different committees and what have you. I'm not quite sure who they are half the time. There's always a committee hanging around somewhere, isn't there? But, it's true, isn't it? What was I going to say? I mean, would it not be a case that if we did do that, it might be, say, 3 steps backwards and then eventually a few more steps forward? I mean, how bad is it really? I mean, they're saying it's really...
Yeah, come on, Joanna, how bad could this be? But Steve's got a point. I mean, practical things. I mean, if you set imagining something is going to be a huge difficulty, then you can create all sorts of bogeymen in the cupboard. I mean, how difficult could this possibly be?
Well, I'll give you an example on a small scale. Just look at Scotland. The Fraser of Allender Institute, which is an independent economic think tank in Scotland, published a report last week saying that a hard Brexit could cause Scotland to lose 134,000 jobs. Now, I'll give you another example from my own constituency on a no-name basis. I went to see a significant businessman in my constituency recently at his request because he is so uncertain about how his business is going to be able to continue trading after Brexit, because he does a lot of trade with other EU countries, that he is thinking of leaving Edinburgh and taking the many jobs that he provides away from Edinburgh and taking them to the Netherlands. He doesn't want to leave, but he feels that he will not be able to continue trading because of the uncertainty about the future. So these are not spanners thrown up by people like myself. They are hard facts coming from people in the business community who are worried about the impact of Brexit on the British economy.
This is Salmond and Sunday on LBC. We're leading Britain's conversation with thoughts from Joanna Cherry QC, member of the Brexit Committee, on how this process is going. Call 0345 6060 973, text 84850, tweet at LBC. This is LBC, the time is 5:45.
LBC through your workday with Alex Salmond.
This is Salmond and Sunday on LBC, leading Britain's conversation, and with an opportunity to question Joanna Cherry, QC MP, member of the House of Commons Brexit Committee, and member, of course, the SNP member for Edinburgh South West. There are lots of calls coming in now. Simon from Westminster, I take it you're not an MP yourself, Simon. What's your question?
No, my question is this. If we take the politics away for the moment and just look at the trade, if one does an analysis of the trade going across the border, probably 80% or 85% is what I might call domestic or white van man or woman traffic going across, with really very, very small degrees of values of trade.
You mean between north and south of Ireland, Simon?
Both ways, either way. And the amount of very large volumes, what you might call container traffic, is relatively small. The companies are known because those companies actually making the product either in the north or the south would be well known. Those could be registered, those would be registered, and therefore whatever deal we come up with at the end, it could be accounted for very, very clearly. So the amount of discrepancy between the significant value of trade and the minor bits of trade would actually be quite small, and therefore aren't we, from a trade point of view, just blowing this, making this a mountain out of a molehill and letting the politicians bat it back and forwards?
Well, John, as Simon says, you're getting this out of proportion. I mean, come on, your committee, surely in this, in the year 2017, surely some way could be found to get round these difficulties.
Well, I mean, I think Simon makes an interesting point. it's a fair enough question. Surely there should be a way around these difficulties. The problem is that the United Kingdom has not yet come up with a way around these difficulties. The government published a position paper last summer wherein it discussed a series of possibilities for solving the problem, but didn't actually come up with a concrete proposal. And we've heard a lot of evidence in the committee about the cross-border trade, and one of the difficulties is that, for example, in agriculture, milk-based products, in the production of a product, the milk, for example, milk-based product will cross the border several times in the course of its productions. Now, I see where Simon's coming from, that it ought to be possible to find a solution, but the reality is that no solution has as yet been found. And that's why we're up against a really tough deadline this week, or at least the UK government is, because they need to come up with a concrete solution, or at least, as the Irish Foreign Minister said today, the parameters of a concrete solution to avoid having a hard border.
Well, a long time ago, I was a young economist in the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries for Scotland, and my counterpart in Danny, which was the Department of Agriculture for Northern Ireland, every time he was asked about why his sheep numbers were wrong and why there were so many more or less sheep in Northern Ireland than were meant to be, always had the same answer. He said, it's a cross-border trade. Ruth from West Hampstead, good afternoon.
Hi. Yeah, I have a question for Joanna. It seems that a lot of people are actually getting quite confused on here this afternoon. I think she's answered questions probably, twice over the same point. Given how close the actual referendum result was and how crucial the border question is in Ireland, would it not just make sense to stay in the single market in the customs union?
Yes.
Does she not think that? I mean, it seems like the only workable answer to me. It was so close. It threatens so many jobs. We don't know what's going to happen to the economy. And this is a way of solving all of it.
Ruth, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's the obvious solution to the border problem. And if I can just toot my colleagues in Edinburgh's trumpet for a moment, the Scottish Government a year ago produced proposals suggesting that the whole of the United Kingdom could stay in the single market and the customs union, which, failing Scotland, in a document called Scotland's Place in Europe. And it's probably the most detailed set of proposals about how to solve the Brexit conundrum that have been produced by any government in these islands so far. And it hasn't been given proper consideration, but they're producing an updated version just after Christmas. And I think the Scottish Government's solution to the problem could yet become the solution to the problem for the whole of the UK, and most particularly for the Irish border problems.
Well, a variant of that, of course, would be to do a Norwegian position, which would be to stay in the single market but not the customs union. And then while, of course, you would have some sort of border between North and South in Ireland, it would be rather like the Norway-Sweden border at the present moment, where Norway is out of the customs union but in the single market. Sweden obviously is in both. And that is a border which is there, is supervised, but it's certainly not a hard border in any sense of the word.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United Kingdom needs to be more imaginative about the solutions that David Cameron's foolish decision to call a referendum for political expediency has got us into. And I completely take your point, Ruth, that it wasn't a big majority for leave, and it's important to remember that 2 out of the 4 nations in the United Kingdom, Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted to remain.
Well, that's Ruth from West Hampstead and Joanna from Edinburgh. I've come up with a joint solution to the government's intractable problems. Robert from Medway, good afternoon, Robert.
Hello. Another week where I'm on. Hello again. Anyway, I actually believe it's just a big whopper, to be completely frank, because Northern Ireland currently, if I want to travel to Northern Ireland, I have to take my passport. So, therefore, there is a border, and it surrounds the whole of Ireland.
You have to take your passport to Northern Ireland, Robert. I mean, I've been to Northern Ireland rather recently, and I did no sign of my passport. The passport to Northern Ireland.
Well, I recently went there for a leadership election, and I had to have my passport.
Which leader were you electing? Sorry, Robert, I beg your pardon. Which leader were you electing? I beg your pardon.
Henry Bolton. But anyway, that's a whole nother
story. Is that the UKIP chap?
Yes, that is.
Well, honestly, I have to say that, Frankie the Tory once was coming to ride in the Air Gold Cup, and Ryanair insisted that he couldn't get on the plane to Stansted, I think it was, unless he had his passport to get to Prestwick Airport in Scotland. but actually, strictly speaking, Ryanair were wrong. And I think, Robert, you should have insisted as a member of UKIP not to take your passport to Northern Ireland. Hugo from Putney, you've got a question. Good afternoon, Hugo.
Yeah, good afternoon, Alex. The question I would like to ask is, assuming that we leave with no deal, I mean, is a hard border even possible? I mean, it's about a 200 or 300 mile, I can't remember the exact distance, gap between Northern Ireland and the UK. So, and Ireland. So, I mean, is it even possible? How feasible is it in the first place?
That's an excellent question, Hugo. I saw somebody, I can't remember who was, suggesting that Donegal should be reincorporated into the United Kingdom to shorten the border. Do you think that's a feasible issue then,
I don't think that suggestion would go down well in Donegal. I've got family from there myself and been on holiday there last summer, and I can assure you that I don't think they're too keen to be reunited with the United Kingdom, much as they might want to keep friendly relations. But to answer your question, Hugo, you're absolutely right. It's a 300-mile long border. Some people who live on the border between the north and the south actually have their front door in the north and their back door in the south. And during the Troubles, there were only certain crossing points. And that's what we fear would happen if there had to be a hard border. That again, because it's such a long rural border, there would only be certain crossing points which goods and people could move across the border, and those would become targets for extremist terrorists who still want to cause trouble.
Now, a couple of tweets are coming in. Alex, surely we need a referendum on the final agreement. We didn't have the information in the last one. It was an emotional vote. That's Simon and Bradford. If we leave in WTO terms, we'll be obliged to enforce the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's from Dawn. Joanna, final word on these matters.
Well, I think the final word is the UK government caused the problem on the border. It's for the UK government to come up with the answer to how you avoid having a hard border. And I think the answer is, as Ruth from Hampstead said, the answer is for the United Kingdom to stay in the single market and the customs union.
You've been listening to me, Alex Salmond, and Joanna Cherry. I'll be back next Sunday from 3. Coming up at 9 p.m, it's Steve Allen's In Conversation. But next, it's Clive Bull. Thank you.